Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stephen Hodgson, and I'm the head of publishing at AMEB. As you will most likely know, at the end of last year, AMEB released new technical work for our lower brass syllabuses, detailed in two brand new publications, Trombone and Euphonium technical work and orchestral excerpts, and Tuba technical work and orchestral excerpts. We also added a brand new examination to the lower brass syllabuses, Preliminary, which is intended to represent the very first steps in an instrumentalist's journey. Today, we're workshopping all of this, the technical work and the new preliminary grade, and we're delighted to have with us one of the two consultants that worked on these new resources, Greg Aitken, to give a little more information and background on the new technical work and preliminary examination, as well as some tips and tricks for preparing students using the new resources. Greg worked tirelessly alongside Brendan Collins, as well as a team of instrumentalist specialists to design the new technical work. So there's really nobody better placed to take you through it all. As Greg leads us through the workshop, do feel free to use the Zoom chat function to send through any questions. We'll answer what we can in the course of the workshop, and we've also set aside a little time at the end for further discussion. So enough from me. Please allow me to introduce Greg Aitken, lower brass technical work consultant and our workshop facilitator today. Greg is well known throughout Australia as a performer, educator and conductor. He held the post of head of brass at the Queensland Conservatorium of Music up until 2017, having taught at a tertiary level in Brisbane for almost 30 years. He has performed with the Queensland and Adelaide Symphony Orchestras, as well as various touring musical productions, while also performing in brass bands nationally and internationally, including the world famous Grimethorpe Colliery Band as part of their Australian tour in 2001. Greg is founder of the brass quintet Bob, Best of Brass, which has toured extensively for the Musica Viva in schools program, and has commissioned several works from Australian composers. Greg is also the owner of the Brass Music Specialists store at Graceville in Brisbane, which he co-founded in 1989. Welcome, Greg. Thank you so much for being here and for your tireless work on the new lower brass technical work last year, which really began a number of years ago.
Well, thanks very much, Steve, and thank you to all for coming along this afternoon, wherever you may be. I appreciate your enthusiasm and engagement with these new publications. It was very exciting to be involved in this creation, and as Steve said, we have got two new publications. You can see them on the screen. The one that has the trombone, euphonium and bass trombone, as well as the orchestral excerpts, importantly, and then the publication which has all the tuba technical work and again the orchestral excerpts. So what I'd like to firstly say is that I appreciate this afternoon that there'll be people looking in who may not be brass teachers, or if they are, they may not be low brass teachers. There will be some, of course, low brass people, and for those people, I apologise if I may go a bit slow and I need a bit too much detail. I'll try not to be teaching grandma to suck eggs, but we would like to go through a lot of the stuff in detail for those who maybe are not so familiar with these family of instruments. So as Steve said, we'll have time at the end for questions, but if you feel the need for something along the way, just type in and Steve will interrupt me if possible, if necessary, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So I'm going to cover a few different areas, obviously, and firstly, I'd like to summarise the changes from the old syllabus to the new. What's there now and why is it there? So a bit of history. In 2017, the manual lists A, B and C were updated into what is now the revised syllabus. Predominantly, there were a number of items which were out of print, and those have been removed and more material put into those lists so that there's a more current list of available options when you're selecting repertoire for students for these exams. And that's across the board. You'd be familiar with the AMEB Series 1 and AMEB Orchestral brass books. They've been retained in the syllabus, but also some of the old items which were no longer in print have been removed. And interestingly, some of the ones that went out of print have come back into print. Some of the old favourites like the Lange Tutor, the Don Lusher solo album, those that we couldn't find for many years have actually come back into print. So then in 2020, we have these new technical workbooks for the bass trombone, the tenor trombone, the euphonium. Those are all in the one book, as I keep saying, and then the tuba book. And this has replaced the old book that was in place for many years. That book was a little bit complex, shall we say, and you'll notice that with this new format, it's laid out in a very straightforward approach for each grade. So you won't be flicking back and forth between pages. And probably more importantly, I know as a teacher, I found that the scale set's a bit confusing, both for sometimes examiners as well as the students. So the scales which are now set for each grade, everyone will need to perform in entirety, or at least learn them, learn all those scales that are presented. And of course, in the examination, the examiner will select which ones that they wish to hear. But you'll find there's quite a variety of scales across all the grades, but as in the past where we had scale sets, that's no longer the case. There's some common exercises across these different instruments. You'll see that the scales have been presented as well as the same technical exercise, particularly with the euphonium. You'll see that there's parallels there. You'll see the trombone and euphonium playing the same scales for some time. When we get to level 2, we'll talk about that shortly. That's a whole different kettle of fish. So there's common exercise across different instruments. Even you'll see similarities with the new trumpet technical workbook and some of these low brass. We hope this sort of more uniform approach will make the whole list of publications a bit more accessible for teachers. Many of you brass teachers will be familiar with the Herbert Clark style scale study. Now that's been included for several instruments. The idea was that this study I've found with students, they find it quite engaging. It's there to familiarise them with their scales, and we encourage them to do them in all keys eventually, but also helps developing with more agile finger and or slide technique. So trombone players, don't be surprised to be seeing the Herbert Clark second study in there. We feel very valuable for all musicians. Then in level 2, as I mentioned, rather than being required to present a separate etude, as in the past, to demonstrate each of the techniques, you'll remember if you were doing grade 5, particularly trombone and above, you would have to front up to the exam with your Arbon and your Eric Claybook and your Remington and your Blazevich. But now what we've done with the assistance of Brendan Collins from Sydney, he's actually created a whole swag of new etudes. Now these are for each instrument, trombone, bass trombone, euphonium and tuba, a different etude for each instrument in each of the 4 grades, 5, 6, 7 and 8. And what we've done is with those studies, instead of playing all the different, we're playing a separate study for each of these skill sets. It's these studies seek to highlight these individual skills within the framework of a 30 to 60 second piece. So my special thanks to Brendan for creating these mini works, which I'm sure teachers and students alike will find very interesting, and they're very rewarding to play. I'm going to do you a little demo on those a little bit later. So talking predominantly about the tuba, if we just go to Leah, if you could put up our tuba exercise here. This is page 9 in the tuba publication. You'll see that what we've done here is we've separated out all of the different keyed tubas. So the 4 different tubas, of which you'd be familiar, all have their own specific range. Now this carries across from preliminary, that's another thing, is the new preliminary grade, as Steve mentioned in his opening. So each tuba has their own range. In the past, we had a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, and that caused some pain for teachers, for students. So in this new publication, they're all separated out, and you can see it very clearly there on page 9 of that publication. There was discussion as to strengths and weaknesses in the past, and particularly for younger players. It did lead to some confusion. Now, looking at these ranges, I must stress that these ranges for the tuba should not be seen as the absolute range. They're a guide. These ranges are the guide from which the scales and keys have been devised for each grade. Now, this is done with the best of intentions to accommodate different instruments and with younger players in mind. Now, if you've got a student that can't quite reach the extremes of the register on their tuba, and this is not just for the tuba, but predominantly tuba, where we've got such a diversity of different ranges with different keyed instruments, don't lose heart. You should not be concerned if your student can't quite reach the extremes. The fundamental focus is that we want good quality of sound across the range. That's our prime focus. So if your student's struggling a little bit in the upper register or can't quite play with good focus sound in the low register, you know, and get to that extreme, don't panic. There's no reason to be concerned. We want to approach those limits by all means, but at preliminary and through the early stages, level 1, that's not going to be the make or break of passing the tuba exam. So please bear that in mind when you're preparing students for these exams. The tuba technical workbook has been presented individually for each tuba in all of the levels, all of the grades from level 1 to 4. So with the technical work in particular, the fundamental etude is a basic lip slur. And you'll see that's common from the trumpet through the trombone all the way to the tuba. So something as basic as an open fifth slur, you'll find that that's the basis for a lot of the technical work across all of the brass instruments that have been revised. So, for example, in the trumpet, you'll be slurring from second line G down to C, and it's the same with the trombone. It's the same with the euphonium, the tuba. The bass trombone doesn't kick in until level 2. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for those who are perhaps not so brass oriented, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about the slurs. As I said, the slur, we're talking about building strong fundamentals of tone quality. That's what it's all about. So I'll just play you a little bit on the trombone and the mouthpiece. Just again, for those who are brass players, I apologise. For those who are not brass players, I hope this is of some assistance. So when we're slurring that basic fifth, and the other way. What makes a good slur and what makes an ordinary slur? A good slur is when we change the pitch immediately without bending the note. And the same when we're going up, as opposed to. So we want to avoid that scooping or bending. That's one thing to watch out for. Another thing is if we have a gap in the continuity of the sound. So again, a proper slur, or one which we find desirable, as opposed to one with a gap. And we hear this commonly with students, particularly in the early stages of their development. Now, if you are having trouble with students achieving this outcome, you can revert to some mouthpiece alone work. And I've found that seems to work pretty well. If we take the pitch, to me is not so important as getting a decent sound on the mouthpiece, a resonant tone. And surprisingly, for a lot of students, it's very difficult to form a buzz without the instrument. When they're just playing the mouthpiece, even students coming in at a tertiary level often struggle with sustaining a pitch or sustaining a resonant buzz on just the mouthpiece. So once we get that established, then the next step will be to bend the pitch. And hopefully, having achieved that, we can move it to the instrument, and again, avoid those scooping, bending slurs, and also the gap slurs. Okay, so that's just a couple of little tips there. Hopefully, will be of use to you. And while we're on that, I'd just like to go through the legato elements of the elements of legato tonguing or soft tonguing on the trombone. This is a technique for non-trombonists. Teachers of trombone who are non-trombonists can find a little confronting. So basically, I'll do that fairly quickly for you. There are three elements which are important. The first element, well, the first thing to understand if you're not a trombonist, is that the trombone has a continuous column of air. We don't have valves which help articulate the change in the pitch. So we have two kinds of slurs on the trombone. We've got the tongue slur or legato tonguing, and then we have the lip slur, which we've seen already. Trombonists, as they develop, learn very quickly which method of tonguing and slurring they need to incorporate to make a successful transition or articulation of a particular passage. When we get to the Brendan Collins exercises a little bit later on, you'll see a bit more of what I mean. But the three elements to make a good legato slur or soft tongue on the trombone, so that we don't get the smear or glissando, we need to make sure that we move the slide fast, not jerky, but it needs to move quickly, and it needs to move as late as possible. So if we move too soon, we'll still get we'll still have elements of the glissando, which are to be avoided, obviously. So we need to move the slide fast or quickly, but as late as possible. We also need to use the tongue, because we don't interrupt the air supply by airflow by use of a valve. Our tongue has to facilitate that slight break in the air column. Now we do this by using a softer tonguing syllable, a da da or do do kind of sound or articulation or tongue, rather than a ta ta, as we would with standard articulation or detached notes or accents or that kind of thing. So instead of a nice we're using a do, do, do. And the third and probably most important item is that we need to try and keep the air flowing. If the air breaks out and dissipates and we don't have good supply, all of our previous two steps are wasted. So slide is fast and late. We do tongue, not to or ta or ti, and we do blow. So I hope that's of use to those non-trombone players out there in Cyberland who are perhaps struggling a little bit with the legato tonguing on the trombone. Okay, so moving now to teachers of the tuba. Tuba teachers who maybe are not experienced tuba players themselves. Here's a couple of tips perhaps to watch out for. A lot of the student model tubas, unfortunately, are delivered to the school or they come to the shop and they are produced with a mouthpiece which is often too large for young players. If you can imagine a young student in year 4 or 5 and they get a tuba, sometimes a compact size tuba, a 3/4 size tuba, but they come with a full size mouthpiece. Now for some of these students, they find it very difficult to fit the mouthpiece between their chin and their nose. And of course, if they can't seal, then there's going to be no tone. And there are some very large mouthpieces come with a variety of instruments. And so I encourage those people who are maybe not familiar with those mouthpiece models and what's available, do seek some advice, whether it be contacting AMEB or a tuba teacher or someone that can give you a few tips perhaps, because you can save a young player an awful lot of unnecessary hard work and heartache with a mouthpiece that's just too big. And while we're on about mouthpieces, this goes across all of the brass instruments, whether it's trumpet or it's tuba and everything in between. It's a good idea to monitor the mouthpieces that your students are using. Do they need perhaps to change along the way? Now, I'm not advocating that they should be changing every week or every month or maybe even every year, but it's a shame to see students struggling at times with a mouthpiece that they've outgrown, or as in the tuba case, maybe started with it's too big and they're really fighting it. So if you're not sure where to go or what to look out for, here's just a couple of things which you might consider. If you have players who are constantly sounding very sharp and have got a pinched or nasal kind of sound, you might notice on the trombone, if they've got their tuning slide abnormally extended to try and get down to pitch, that's quite often a telltale sign that the mouthpiece is too narrow or too shallow and the player has outgrown it. They've got bigger and stronger and their strength is pushing the pitch high. That's something that is quite common as players, particularly when they start to hit the teen years and they really grow. They've got plenty of air, they've got plenty of strength, but the trombone, the mouthpiece is kind of like the shoe they were wearing in grade 5 and it doesn't fit anymore. That's a really common thing to watch out for. Another one will be if a player has poor endurance. A player that you know is quite diligent in their practice, they're doing all the right things, but they just chop out in a very short space of time. So this could be either the mouthpiece is too small, like the previous case, where they're struggling with it and there's not adequate blood flow to the lips and they're burning out, or the other side, it could be that it's too big and they're burning up all their strength trying to maintain pitch and sound in a mouthpiece that's just too big for them. So all of the mouthpiece manufacturers have charts and things online. There's a wealth of resources. There's publications about mouthpieces and what they can and can't do. I'm sure there's chat forums. There's all sorts of stuff. But it's good to talk to people who play the different instruments. Hopefully you've got someone in your area that you can refer to. But as Steve will tell you later, if there's any other stuff that you think might be of assistance, then please do contact AMEB or they'll put you in touch with the right people, shall we say.
Hi, Greg. Sorry.
Yes.
Just a question that's come through with regards to that. From Matthew, how do the letter number mouthpiece designations work? Are you able to give a brief summary of how that works? He said, I went from 12C to 6.5 AL to 5G to 4G and don't know what that means.
That sounds like a perfect transition. The 12C is what comes with most student model instruments for trombone, sometimes with euphonium. And then the 6.5 AL is a wider dynamics, 25.4 millimeters, or maybe a little bit less. And that's a good all-rounder. That's the size that our hero James Morrison plays. That's a good all-round size. If you're getting serious, you're playing a larger instrument, you're playing more classical stuff, and you're getting, as I say, fairly into it, then a 5G or a 4G they're very common sizes for tertiary students and professional players. So Matthew, if you're up to 4G, that's a very common size for big, strong players who are doing all their practice and working at least at a tertiary level. In the trumpet mouthpieces, it's a little bit different, but funnily, the bigger the number, as in 12, the smaller the mouthpiece. The 1.5 or the 1 is the biggest mouthpiece. They're bass trombone sizes. And then along the way, the 4 and the 5G, then the 6.5 and the 7C. So it's a progression. So 12 being the biggest number, the smallest mouthpiece, and 1 being the smallest number, but the biggest mouthpiece. Having said that, different manufacturers do it different ways. So those numbers I've just rattled off are Bach numbers, also common with Joseph Clear. Dennis Wick numbers run the same way, but Schilke numbers and Yamaha numbers run to a very different system. So in trombones for Schilke and Yamaha, they start with the small trombones around the 45, 47, and they go through to the bass trombone is the number 60. But the the numbers from the Schilke and from Yamaha start down at number 6 being trumpet mouthpieces, right up to sort of 80 being tuba mouthpieces. So they put all their range into one numerical order, whereas other makers have a numbered series for each instrument. So I hope that helps you, Matthew.
Great. And just while we've got you, while we're pausing for a moment on your presentation, a question from Kate. Is it a good idea to start on the euphonium in year 4 or 5 before moving to the tuba later on if a student desires to play the tuba?
It can be. I mean, some students just have their heart set on the tuba and they just want to play the tuba. But having said that, in grade 4 and 5, students can be not very large, and tubas can be very large, and it can be a bit daunting with a small student carrying a large tuba around. The other part of the problem is large instruments can get damaged if they're in the hands of a student who can't quite manage them. So that's something to watch out for. Euphonium is a great leader to the tuba, yes. With young students getting used to the bigger mouthpiece, particularly if they've come, say, from trumpet. It's not common to move someone from trumpet straight to tuba. Euphonium could be a good transition point. Euphonium is certainly a great instrument to start on. And the other one that's really popular, as I don't know about so much in other states, but in Queensland, we now have grade 3 students playing brass instruments, as the grade 7s have now become the first year at high school. So a very popular instrument in the primary school has become the baritone, or the baritone horn, little 3-valve instrument, and a few manufacturers make them. And they're a terrific instrument for younger players and smaller players to get started. They're the same pitch as the euphonium, the same pitch as the trombone, but they're a lot more compact and easier for small students to carry around. And they're a great stepping stone onto euphonium or later tuba. But okay, if the student really wants to play the tuba, then they are definitely to be encouraged. There are quite a lot of tubas around now of the what we call compact or 3/4 size, and there's several manufacturers doing them. A lot are made in China, which has brought the cost down significantly. And what a lot of schools are doing is having the students will have an instrument at school and a second instrument that they keep at home. And that sounds very, very plush and very expensive, but it has two effects. One is that the instruments last longer because they're not getting transported and damaged in transit. And the student then can ride their bike, or they can go on the bus or the train or whatever, and not have to worry about this cumbersome tuba accompanying them. So that's happening a lot here with the department in Queensland, with double basses, with cellos, baritone saxes. That's becoming quite a popular practice. So I hope that helps, Kate. So moving, there was one more item I wanted to just touch on, mouthpieces. So we talked about the player being very sharp, a player with poor endurance, and the last one is a player who's struggling for good tone quality. As I said, to preface this whole low brass approach, we're really focusing on good tone quality. How can we make a better tone? And if that student is struggling, again, perhaps at the extremes of range, although not always, players struggling to play with a good sound in the low register, perhaps the mouthpiece is too small and is inhibiting their ability to get lower, or maybe it's too big, which prevents them getting high. So they're different things to watch out for. In his book, The Trombone Technique from years ago, Dennis Wick says that a brass player should be playing the biggest mouthpiece they feel comfortable on. So I think that's, fairly sound advice. But don't be afraid to experiment. If you're a teacher of a few brass kids, don't be afraid to try a few different instruments. Don't just think, oh, well, everyone plays a 5C on the trumpet, so everyone's got to play a 5C on the trumpet, or whatever it is on the trombone or the tuba. There are a range of instruments, and there's a reason for there being a range of mouthpiece sizes, range of mouthpieces and sizes, and that's because everybody is different. So just quickly, some of the other things which you'll find, and this comes up in exams, this comes up for low brass players, particularly when they're perhaps just early stages of going into the lower register. what we would call the trigger register or the fourth valve register. If you're a trombone or a euphonium player, you know what I'm talking about. So we're engaging the trigger or the fourth valve on the euphonium, and we're starting to get into that territory where the bass trombones start to come into their strength. There's very common faults, shall we say, that occur here with people venturing into this territory for the first time. So again, we can have that pinched or nasal kind of sound when we go into the low range. You'll be familiar with this kind of sound. So the lips are very closed, the jaw's closed. There's not much quality to the sound. This is common with students who are used to a student model instrument, only 3 valves on the euphonium. They've been playing the baritone. They're new to the bass trombone. They don't know what a trigger is. They've never had one before. All these things can contribute to this kind of sound. So what we need to do is encourage them to open their mouth wider. We talk about the taw, dropping the jaw, whether it's down or forward or both. Again, some experimentation is required, but we really need to fill that sound out. And this can only happen with a good air supply. So as these students develop, we really want to be harping on about the breath, breathing, breathing, breathing. I don't know any brass workshop or masterclass that I've ever attended where breathing wasn't one of the major topics of discussion. So I'm not a terrific breather, and I tend not to bang on about it as a result, but it is fundamental to making a good sound on a brass instrument. And as we get into this low register, you'll find as the mouthpiece gets bigger, the amount of jaw opening gets greater. So the trombone in the low register, without the trigger, we're at low E, and that's about it, unless we play into the pedal range. And the notes in between are missing. For non-trombonists and non-trigger, that's where the trigger comes in. So the trigger fills in the notes in between. And if you're listening closely, you'll notice that there's a note missing before the pedal B flat. We'll talk about that shortly. But in order to get the sound quality, as I mentioned, we've got to get that jaw down. So I'll try and show a little bit more. And see, as I'm getting lower, the jaw is quite more pronounced. Okay. Without that adjustment, I can still get the notes, but the quality of sound is poor. And I can't get any power. If you're familiar with some of those big sounding bands or orchestras with that bass trombone and tuba really filling it, if you listen to Star Wars soundtracks or orchestral works by Mahler, that big stuff, that's because those players have really got the air going and the mouth in the right place. If you're looking closely, you'll see that I'm also adjusting where the slide goes for the low octave when I engage the trigger. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I just want to bring that to your attention now as I move on to perhaps a different area. So now talking about different instruments, their expectations and limitations. Now we're bringing this back in line with what's in the syllabus. In terms of suitability of instruments for different grade levels, there's quite a few common questions, and here are a few suggestions that I hope will help and might give you an idea where the thinking is coming from, where we've set these grades. This aligns with the ranges of the different instruments in the different grades, the requirements, and the scales and keys. This evolution of the scales as you see them in the new technical workbook was quite time consuming, and it wasn't just a random pulled scales out of the hat. There's all sorts of things going into the consideration of this, but let's just keep on about the instruments for a moment. So basically, if we talk euphonium for a moment, for level 1, preliminary through to grade 4, a 3-valve instrument will be sufficient. This will enable the student to cover the required range and repertoire. 3 valves, as you see there, will be adequate. For level 2, a 4-valve instrument is preferred. You might have a 4th valve on the side. You might have a 4th valve on the top, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Either of those are fine. But without 4 valves from grade 5 onwards, there will be some limitations, obviously, to the range, but it also limits the repertoire that you are able to successfully perform at this level. So as we're moving higher, there's an expectation that the candidate's going to have a better quality instrument that will enable them to cover both the range necessary for the scales, but also the range necessary for the repertoire. A compensating instrument will also have an even better outcome. Now, when we were devising the scales and looking at the repertoire, etc., there were a number of comments from the panel, or the advisors, if you like. Some of these notes are not able to be played adequately in tune on an instrument which is non-compensating. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with these instruments, I'm just going to show you the compensating system. This is an old euphonium, but the compensating system was designed and patented a very long time ago. These 2 tubes you see on the back, on the 3rd valve, and this one on the 1st valve in particular, that is the system of compensation. Now, when we play into the low register on a brass instrument, many of you will be familiar that the pitch gets progressively sharper as we go lower. And if you remember just a minute ago, I was talking about the trombone and adjusting the slide in the low or trigger register. And that system of tubing on the euphonium or the tuba, it comes on both, that's an automatic compensating system. Just briefly, it reticulates the air, if you like, back through the 4th valve, and it goes around the loop a second time and engages those smaller tubes, which flattens the pitch in the low register. On the trombone, we don't have the luxury of compensating, but we have a manual compensator. We just move the slide out a bit further. If that's sounding a bit confusing, think about the trumpet for a moment. Perhaps you're more familiar there. And as the trumpet players go down to, say, their D on 1 and 3, or C sharp 1, 2, 3, you notice that they extend the 3rd in particular, and sometimes the 1st slide as well. As the instrument gets bigger, the amount of tubing required to lower it by a semitone also gets bigger. So on a trumpet or the trombone or the euphonium, when we have got a number of valves in combination, on the trombone slide we're further out, the amount of extra tubing required is more. On the trumpet, we extend the slides. On the trombone, we extend the hand slide. On the euphonium and the tuba, we don't have that luxury. There are no slides and things. Some modern euphoniums, you'll see trigger mechanisms, but that old system of compensating only engages in the very low register once the 4th valve is pushed, and then it does that. It flattens it as we go lower. There are instruments without that compensating system which will still have tuning problems. They will still be sharp in the low register without that system. If you think about orchestral style tubas, which instead of facing to the right like the euphonium, face to the left, you'll see often tuba players reaching over to the front of the tuba and manually adjusting slides as they play. Hopefully the tuba part doesn't have lots of fast moving notes so that they're working too furiously, but you'll see them in the orchestra when they're holding big long notes that they've positioned that slide so that they've got it nicely in tune. They've manually compensated for intonation problems inherent with the instrument. So they're just a couple of things which might help you overcome some tuning issues. Okay, so where did I get up to? All right, so so again, the better quality instrument is going to help the students achieve a better result in terms of their scales when we're going into the low range. And also a lot of modern repertoire, euphonium and tuba, does explore those lower extremes of register. So it's worth considering that perhaps more expensive instrument or some way of achieving that by getting a better instrument than the 3-valve or the non-compensating. Okay, so enough of that. Moving just quickly on to tubas. Another common question, do we need 3 or 4 or more valves? Again, the compensating system. Do we have a left-facing tuba? Do we have a right-facing tuba? Left-facing tubas are more in what we call an orchestral style. They play in the bass clef the same as the other tubas. They just point in a different direction. There's no difference between left and right-facing tubas apart from the way they face. They still play the low register like all tubas. 3 or 4 valves? Well, the 3-valve E-flat and B-flat tubas, these are the most commonly used instruments in schools here in Queensland. I suspect they're the most commonly used instruments throughout the country for schools. They are the least expensive and they are the most manageable for younger students. With this in mind, the level 1 repertoire for tuba and the technical work is all playable on the instrument with 3 valves. You know, you're saying, oh, but the range is different. Yes, but remember, in our tuba book, as we saw the slide earlier, the range has been specified for each tuba. So in the past, we were all bundled in together. In the new book, from level 1 to 4, well, actually from preliminary through to 4, they're all specified separately so that the player of each tuba gets the advantage of lip slurs which pertain to their instrument. So lip slurs with no fingers to change the slur, it's straight like that open fifth I showed earlier. So they've got it specific to their instrument. F and C tubas are quite uncommon with less than 4 valves. Often they have more. They're also not very common in a student model instrument. We see very few of these at schools. Yes, there are exceptions, but there are now some lower priced instruments entering the market. And so these keyed tubas have been included. So as I just said, F and C tubas are also itemized separately in the tuba publication. So you can see the ranges, the slurs, the technical work specific to each instrument, which is really important. The tuba players I've spoken to are thrilled with that idea. For level 2, again, it's preferred that the student will have a 4-valve instrument, just as we had for the euphonium a moment ago. The player is going to benefit from the added low range facility. It's going to help them with their tone quality and their intonation. We're banging on again about tone quality. The scales for level 2 have been designed with the 4, and I say again, or more valve instrument in mind. Often these tubas, left-facing ones in particular, tubas with rotary valves, they might have 4 valves, they might have 5 valves, sometimes as many as 6 valves. They're very expensive instruments. We're not likely to see them for 5th grade tuba. But if you're following that F or C tuba track, those instruments are not uncommon. The trombone and the bass trombone. We're still on about questions people have about instruments and what's expected. Shall we have a trigger or not? If we're a bass trombone, should we have 1 or 2 triggers? The tenor trombone without a trigger can be used throughout all grades, from preliminary to grade 8. This was a conclusion that we came to after much deliberation. Trombone players in orchestras don't necessarily have a trigger on the first trombone. Trombone players in fine bands don't always have a trigger if they're playing the upper part. We felt it would have been discriminating against trombone players without a trigger had we made the requirements for the range extend into the trigger register. So I'll say again, the tenor trombone without trigger can be used throughout all grades for the tenor trombone exams. Having said that, the trombonist who has a trigger has greater range of possibilities in terms of where the range that they can use for the scales. They might be able to play, say, the E-flat scale for 2 octaves by using the lower E-flat or lower. and also the choices of solo repertoire. There is so much solo repertoire where having a trigger is making life so much easier. So we've tried to keep that open, that yes, you can get by without a trigger, but I'd strongly recommend the trigger is a serious consideration. The bass trombone, as with the previous syllabus and technical workbook, it only begins at level 2. So from grade 5 to 8 is where the bass trombone launches. Up to grade 4, we considered that all trombonists would have fairly common skills, fairly similar range, those kinds of things. The bass trombone really becomes a specialist instrument from about grade 5 onwards, and that's where the paths diverge. So as it was before, from grade 5 on, that's where we see bass trombone standing alone. Now, whether you have 1 or 2 triggers, that's a choice which is dependent on several factors, not least of all is cost. But the repertoire and the range of technical works, so the scales, etc., will be much more easily mastered if you've got a 2-trigger bass trombone. Before, when I played the trombone down to the pedal note, I showed you the trigger notes and I mentioned there was a note missing. That's the B natural. There is no low B natural on the tenor trombone or the bass trombone with 1 trigger unless you extend the F slide right out until we have it, not a B flat F trombone, but a B flat E trombone. This is all getting a bit technical, but by extending that slide means I can eventually get a B natural. But it's very difficult to do that in the middle of a scale or in the middle of a piece. So that's why the double trigger bass trombone was invented. It makes the bass trombone so much more agile, gives them so many or more options, and makes that range much easier to achieve. So hopefully I haven't bored you with too much there, but that's a little bit about the thinking behind the ranges, what's expected in terms of instruments and their capabilities and the mechanics. So back to the syllabus, the manual lists and designing the examination program. So to maintain the concept of presenting a varied programming for the examination, the excerpts, which are list D, have been retained, but there is a greater emphasis in this case in list C. We've got much more popular and contemporary publications. A lot of people have said, "Oh, why should we play excerpts? They don't, they're not current anymore. They're not hip. They're not cool. They're not fun to practice." Well, there's a really good explanation in the front of the book, which I encourage you to read, which basically pays homage to the orchestra as an ensemble. And for trombonists, it's difficult for euphoniums, but tubas and trombones and bass trombones, orchestral repertoire is still the major ensemble. That the orchestra is the thing. That is the flagship. Whether you ever get to play in an orchestra or you get to play only in the band or you only get to play in the brass quintet or whatever it is you get to do, I really encourage you to listen to some of the great masterpieces of the orchestra. And hearing the low brass section in full flight in some of those big works is really chilling. It's a thrilling experience. Chilling's maybe not the right word, but a very thrilling experience. So I do encourage you to engage there. We have cut the excerpts back. Where there used to be 6, 8, 10 excerpts, there are now only 4 required to be learnt for each of the grades 5 to 8. 4 excerpts. They've been set out in a new format in the technical workbook with excerpts. Have all been re-edited and some errors removed. All of the euphonium parts that were, as is with the Strauss works, which had a B-flat transposition, they are now all in C bass clef, concert pitch. The Holst, which is the planets, has always been in the B-flat transposed treble clef. That remains the same. Some of the excerpts have been shifted from one grade to another, which seems to reflect more the appropriate standard. But getting back to designing the manual of lists. So list D, excerpts, yes. List C, some more popular contemporary kind of some pieces there that are more perhaps engaging for our younger folk. There's some wonderful new stuff that's been included. I encourage teachers to have a look at some of these new selections. There's a terrific lot of stuff there. List A and B have retained their focus. So list A is your unaccompanied or etude kind of work, and list B is still pre-20th century. So that's the design of the syllabus, the revised syllabus. The new kid on the block is preliminary. Now, preliminary grade this is new across all brass instruments, and it is for all brass instruments. So the trumpet has it, the trombone has it, the euphonium, and the tuba. The bass trombone doesn't have it because we don't have bass trombone until grade 5. This is, as Steve said at the beginning, it's an opportunity for early learners of brass to engage with the formality of the examination process, but without putting them under too much pressure. So they're going to be doing very simple things like that basic lip slur, that slur of a fifth that we did earlier on, using the mouthpiece, always focusing on a good tonal quality. So that slur, that's seen as one of the fundamental skills in building that good quality. A nice quality of breath combined with adequate embouchure. At this level, we should be producing a secure sound, and this is a lovely foundation for ongoing development in young brass players. The other element in there is a reduced scale. So they play just the first 5 notes, the first fifth of their major scale. Now, this will be similar to early pages they're using in their method book at school. It'll be material that's common, the stuff that they're likely to encounter in their school band, whether it's their band or they might be doing it in classroom or instrumental music education. So there's a little bit of overlap there, we hope. These are attainable goals, and it gives the students a sense of achievement. So that's preliminary. In this preliminary, in the manual list, there are a number of new works by Australian composer Craig Ross. Craig's a trumpeter in Sydney, and he's been very accommodating in rescoring stuff specifically for the tubas. And there's some stuff in there which is geared specifically for young players. So I urge you to go and have a look at some of that stuff. Craig Ross, and it's terrific. It's very, very Australian. So we're now the selection process for our.
Sorry, Greg. Just while I've got you, there's a couple of questions that have come through, and I thought that it might be a good time. Can one perform grade 5 bass trombone exam on a B flat and F tenor trombone?
Yes, I can't see any reason why not. I think that's fine.
From Kate, does one from each clef need to be represented in the exam for trombone, euphonium, orchestral excerpts? Oh, does one from each clef need to be represented in the exam for trombone and euphonium orchestral excerpts?
No, I don't believe so.
And in fact, for the euphonium, we know that there's been quite a bit of angst around the euphonium excerpts in the past. So what we've done for this current edition is make sure that there are enough of the bass clef excerpts and the treble clef excerpts that you could do one or the other. So if you're more comfortable just reading bass clef, you can just do the bass clef excerpts. If you want to take that as an opportunity to read in treble clef, and the treble clef excerpts are all in B flat, then you could do that as well. But there's no requirement to do both if that's not where the student is heading, and that's not something that you want to take on. And then finally, from Neil, if a student has a trigger on their tenor trombone, do they have to use it for the technical work from grade 5 up, or is it optional?
That would be optional. If they've got the trigger, then there's no actual requirement that they use it. But the suggestion would be that it will make life easier and will perhaps also open up opportunities for some of the technical work. As I mentioned, the scales and the solo repertoire as well. There's solo repertoire where having the trigger gives you more choices. But no, certainly It's not a requirement.
Thanks for that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. So the key signatures and the scales, as I mentioned in the outset, we've removed the scale sets as we're in the previous technical workbook. There was confusion around some of these. If you did this scale set where you did double tonguing, and if you did that scale set, you had to do clefs, and you did this or alternate, blah, 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 blah. So hopefully it's been now simplified where everyone prepares the same. There's no guarantee you're going to be asked the same. You know, in an exam, there's time constraints. The examiner can see that you've got this under control. We're going to focus on this more than that, etc. But the selection of the keys is something that we took some considerable time in working out and coming up with the finished layout, if you like. So it's hoped that over a course of several exams, the students are going to focus on several key centers. So you can appreciate the process. We've got different keys of tubas to consider. In the past, some of the scales which require the trombone to be extended to 7th position, we had scales appearing in level 2 where trombone players who are young perhaps their arms haven't developed sufficiently to reach those outer positions. We had 3 and 4 valve euphoniums and tubas. So the range and the keys, or the range of keys, does vary slightly across different instruments. You will see that there's related majors, minors, dominant, sevenths, diminished. They are all grouped together, but perhaps not all the same for each instrument. I hope that's clear enough. What we hope is that you've got a diversity of keys, which makes it interesting in each grade. The Herbert Clark study, which I mentioned earlier, has been put in a few times. As I mentioned, I've had many students engage with that at all ages, and I still hear professional players practicing that one. It's a quirky little thing, and it just helps you get your mind and your fingers and your slide around those first 5 degrees of the scale. And I really encourage all students to take that up and learn it across all the different key centers, and it just unlocks, pardon the pun, the keys. So for trombonists, we have moved B minor. It now is seen first in grade 4. So B, which is 7th position, as a starting note, is problematic for young trombone players. If you don't have a trigger, you've got to go to 7th position. And if you're in grade 3, perhaps your arm isn't quite long enough. Hopefully, at grade 4 level, we can achieve a better sense of intonation, which when we face it, that's a very important aspect of learning the scales, is that intonation aspect. So A harmonic minor is now in grade 3. Now that has a similar issue with B natural still being in 7th position, but now that it's not the starting note of the scale, we hope that that sort of takes the focus off that B. Not that we don't want to aim for good intonation, but as the 2nd degree of the scale, it's not quite as crucial as the tonic. So that's a couple of considerations that you can appreciate when we were allocating key centers and scales to different levels. The physicality of the instrumentalists also came into the decision process.
Related to that, Greg, sorry, Fredericks asked, young students have difficulty with the 6th position C, which is introduced early. What can you suggest?
Well, unfortunately, there's got to be some what's the word? I guess compromise. I mean, yes, 6th position is always the longest extent when you're in year 4 or 5. How do we get around that? I don't know that there is an escape plan. There's different trombones with triggers for younger students. I haven't addressed that today, but really, I would just hope that by the time the students get to exam ready and you know, okay, we're bringing them in at preliminary and they've got to play B flat, then C, I'm sure the examiner is going to make allowance for a certain amount of sharpness with a very short-armed student, shall we say. But I mean, there is no escape. If we don't play C major or we don't play the C, we limit our key centers that we can choose from. I mean, we can't start at 5th position playing in D flat or G flat major when we're only in year 3 or 4. It doesn't sort of make sense. So it's a compromise between physically I can reach, and then I've also got to cover the range, but I don't want to make it too hard in terms of the key sign or the key center that I'm confusing young students. So it's maybe not an ideal outcome, but I feel, and Brendan is also a trombonist, and we went backwards and forwards over this numerous times to try and get the best fit. So I'm hoping it's going to fit most people, but I can't promise it's going to help everybody, that's for sure. I would say when the students, perhaps not at the start, but when you're moving down the track a bit in the higher grades, don't be afraid to play the scales in the register that suits you the best. And this might come in, like if a student, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got a trigger on your trombone or you've got 4 valves on your UFO or your tuba, don't be afraid to play those scales for 2 octaves or play the lower octave of the scale. There's requirements there, some scales in 1 octave, some scales in 2 octaves. If a scale's only required in 1 octave, but you've got a trigger and you can do it in 2 octaves, then why not? These scales shouldn't be seen as a limitation. It's not there to limit the student having a bit of a show off, if you like. Look, I can play this one upper octave, lower octave. I can play 2 octaves. You know, the scale shouldn't be seen as something that's a limit. It's a suggestion, as is the range. You know, there have to be guidelines, but that's not an absolute. So as I said earlier, don't be concerned if you can't quite play the upper range notes. That's not going to make the difference between a pass and a fail. They're a guide, if you like. On the scales, the trombone and the euphonium players have the same scales, but the tubas are not the same. From grade 5 to 8, the tubas all have the same range requirement and they have the same scale requirement. It's in grades preliminary to grade 4 where they're separated out and they get their own little bit of turf to cover. But by grade 5, level 2, we felt that it's time now that they all came in and played the same range and the same repertoire. Now that's going to make, the same technical work. In terms of repertoire, I'd encourage teachers to check what range is going to fit the C tuba, the B flat, the E flat, the F tuba, and their student. Obviously, a selection of repertoires in there so that you can make choices which will play to your students' strengths. That's the whole intention there. But again, over the course of a number of exams, students are going to encounter a wide range of key centers. That's the intention. The dominant and diminished arpeggios, we're all familiar with those pages of Arbans where they're bop, 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 bop. Well, they are no longer the norm. The diminished and the dominant arpeggios are now in their simplest form. And so you don't need to adhere to those patterns like Arbans, which I was just singing. So they're just spelled out in their straight form. For example, and whether it covers 1 or 2 octaves according to the level you're at. They do need to be memorized for the exam. In the past, there was a discrepancy. In the syllabus, it said all from memory. In the technical workbook, it said these can be read, and there was confusion. It says very clearly now, early in the piece, apart from preliminary and perhaps grade 1, I'd have to check, all technical work has to be memorized. The exceptions are the works written by Brendan Collins from grade 5, 6, 7, 8. So all those new compositions, you can read those. They don't need to be memorized.
And the technical exercises in level 1 as well. So the lip slurs and the Clark exercises can be read from the music. Mostly they probably won't be, but that's allowed. That's
just level 1, grade 1, Steve, is that correct?
No. So the exercises all the way from preliminary through to grade 8, the technical exercises, the lip slurs, the Clark exercises,
Oh, okay.
and Brendan Collins' studies, they can all be read from the music
Okay.
all the way through. But the scales and arpeggios have to all be played from memory.
Thank you. So the tempi for all the scales and exercises have been revised, hopefully to set a more realistic goal for students at each grade level. So those studies that Brendan's written, and I'm going to demo a couple of those in a second. In the previous low brass technical workbook, it highlighted the importance and diversity of so many technical elements required to progress as a brass player. So we're all familiar with the Arban double tonguing, and as I mentioned, your Blazevich clefs. These are certainly diverse skills, and they're crucial in the development of students of brass. For low brass, and particularly trombone, previously there was just too much information required in the examination, and it put pressure on timing. It made the examination a bit more grueling. So these new studies, the intention is that these will replace in examination all those separate elements by including them. So I want to stress that they're not going to replace learning to double tongue in the lesson. They're not going to replace learning your clefs or learning your alternate positions. There are elements of those contained in these exercises which will be on display in the examination. So what I'm saying is that teachers will still need to have an Arban, and the students will need to have an Arban and do all those things that they've always done. What we've done is condensed the separate items into these exercises for the exam context. So if Leah, if you could put up the exercise for grade 5, please, on the screen. This is the first one that Brendan's done that I'm going to play for you today. And just to explain, you'll see at the top of the page, it outlines the different elements. So we've got slurring. You can see plenty of slurring there. We've got lip slurring, and we've got natural slurring, and we've got some soft tonguing or tongue slurs, or legato if you like. We've also got some tenor clef, and a very brief introduction. There right at the end, you'll see there's an alternate position, the 4 marked above the second last bar. Now, there are other alternate position options within the piece. I'll just play it through for you. If you just try and have a look at those different elements as they arise. So particularly with the slurring and the tenor clef, I think they're really strong elements in this. See those different elements there, and I think it's a great way of addressing a number of features. It's a nice little exercise of maybe 20 or so seconds, and it really highlights the different technical things there. As I said, there are other alternate position options, and I think it's quite a musical little study, and I think that the teachers and students are going to enjoy these kind of exercises. So again, you'll need to keep your Blazevich, your Bordoni, your Remington, your Arban, your Eric Clay, your McDonald. All those books are still super important, but we're just not going to get you to cart them all to the exam and do them independently. So Lee, if we could go to the grade 6 one now. You'll see we have the same 4 elements: slurring, double tonguing, alternate positions, and tenor clef. But I think you'll see also that the degree of difficulty, if you like, has been scaled up somewhat. And there's now some more intervallic work. The dynamics are a little bit more complex. The exercise is a little bit longer, as you expect, as we go to grade 6. But again, I think it's a terrific little exercise. On the 3rd line, bar 9, you'll see those alternate positions. Those of you not trombone players will need to work with your students on alternate positions on the different harmonics, endeavoring to keep the sound quality the same. That's the trick with the alternate positions, having the slide in the correct position so that we get the right tone quality. We don't want it to lose its quality as we use alternate positions. So again, I'll play this one through, and I hope this highlights some of those different elements. Again, Brendan, terrific little pieces. So I'll draw your attention to the bibliography, which is in the syllabus. There are, again, a number of those suggested pieces, suggested writers in there: Arben, Blažević, Clay, Remington. It's not an extensive list, but there are definitely publications in there which are well worth engaging with. I mentioned the excerpts and how they're included, and Steve and his team were terrific in sourcing clean skins and removing errors there. We mentioned about the clefs. You don't need to play all bass clef or some of each clef. You can select as suits you. And I mentioned there that with the revised syllabus, there are only 4 excerpts required to be learnt for each grade, and only 2 will be heard in the examination. So as we're getting a bit closer to time, I'll just quickly outline the various technical requirements at different stages. So just an overview, if you like. At preliminary level, we're looking at a basic lip slur and a reduced scale. Tone quality is our fundamental focus. This is an introduction with achievable goals. A fairly small component of the exam is the technical work. Then we move to level or grades 1 to 4, and we're starting to develop the keys and the range. Technical development is including tone quality, finger and slide facility. Various articulations are emerging. We're developing awareness of intonation, some alternate slide positions or fingering for ease of execution. So the technical work at grades 1 to 4, it's more extensive, and it's a graduated series of demands through these formative years. It's a more significant proportion of the exam and with growing importance. And then that takes us to level 2, grades 5 to 8. And here we're extending the range. It's quicker tempos for scales and continued range of key centers. We've got clef reading. Remember, for trombones, we'll also have alto clef. We've got extended intervals, more of the multiple tonguing, double and triple tonguing, some alternate positions, and a higher expectation of the quality of intonation and, of course, tone quality. There's a greater emphasis within this exam, and it's requiring a higher level of preparation and expectation. So hopefully that shows you the 3 different levels and a bit of an overview of the expectations and what you can expect and what the examiner will be expecting. So we've got some time left for questions. Before we throw to that, I'd like to thank you for coming along this afternoon and being involved. Thank you for your questions. We've got time for some more questions. I'll throw back to Steve if there's anything else you need to say before we wrap up.
No, thank you very much. There have been a couple of questions that have come through that we haven't managed to get through to. First of all, from Kate, what's being planned for French horn, and are there any more grade books coming out for lower brass? We're actually currently in the middle of revision for French horn, so that's underway right now. We're hoping for a release at the end of the year, all things going well. We'll confirm later on this year. And similarly, we are planning to release gradebooks for lower brass. Again, that's already started. Hopefully, we'll manage to get to the finish line by the end of the year for those as well. But yes, underway, both for new gradebooks for lower brass and for an entire French horn revision. And that will include a manual of syllabus and gradebooks and technical work, the whole shebang. From Deborah, we've got a request to see a lip slur exercise. Is it possible for Leah to flash up that picture that I sent through? The grade 1 trombone technical lip slur exercise? So that's what it looks like at grade 1. So it's just Greg can tell us more about that one. that one.
Yeah, you can see, Kate, that's pretty straightforward. And it's uniform across trombone, euphonium. It's the same exercise, I believe, in the trumpet book as well. Just using the first three or four partials to just get them used to that concept of as it says there, quality of tone, clarity of attack, blah blah blah, and keeping the slurs smooth, like I was demonstrating earlier. So they're not bumpy, they're not lumpy, they're not gappy. That's basically it, and that it just shows it goes through the first 3 positions.
But that style of exercise is featured all the way through
yes.
level 1, and that really is at the heart of this new emphasis on tone and having control over tone across the range of the instrument. That's more or less it. A couple of questions have come through that we'll get back to people. Oh, just one moment. Can we see some of the grade 7 tuba technical exercises? I'm afraid we don't have any of those prepared. Greg might be able to flash something up. I'm not sure whether you'll see it on screen, but you may have to get hold of the book to have a look at those.
Yeah. I don't know.
There we go. So similarly, intervals, slurring, double tonguing, the same kind of requirements as the other instruments, but they just get more and more complex each year, of course.
Exactly.
I think that's more or less everything that's come through. Any further questions from anybody, please do send them through. And if you have any sort of more involved questions, please do feel free to send those through to online@ameb.edu.au, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible with whatever further questions you have. But I believe that concludes our AMEB Lower Brass Workshop. The syllabus and all publications, of course, are available at your local music shop via ameb.edu.au and via other online sheet music retailers. Thank you once again to Greg Aitkin for an illuminating and very interesting workshop today. Thank you so much for that. But also to Greg Aitken and Brendan Collins for their contribution to the syllabus and to the new technical work and preliminary manual lists. And also thanks to specialist reviewers Matthew van Emmerich, Will Farmer, Brad Lucas, Brett Page, Heather McWilliams, and Per Forsberg. Proof players, Karina Philippi, Elijah Cornish, and again, Matthew van Emmerich, and the whole proofreading and editing team, as well as our expert typesetter, David Howell, for all of their work on this amazing couple of books. Thanks also to the behind-the-scenes AMEB team, Jeff Higgins, Leah Phillips, and Alana Caldwell, for their work in making this workshop possible. To the AMEB CEO, Bernard De Pasquale, and the other AMEB staff. And last but certainly not least, to all of you who are either attending this workshop live or watching it a little bit later on YouTube. We hope that these 2 new technical work and orchestral excerpts books, one for tuba and one for trombone and euphonium, as well as the new preliminary grade, serve the lower brass community as a useful and inspiring resource for years to come. So thanks again, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon. Thanks.